Okay, so some of you may know this already, but did you know that PvP mode in Tower Defense Simulator actually has 3 ranks or 3 tiers in the game, that being low, mid and high? Because of that, there are actually different enemies that spawn in PvP mode depending on which type of game that you do. So here, as you can see, I'm paired with a level 66. Now, for the most part, in low rank games, it is easy mode. That means that it's actually the same as PvP tests previously. So this means that each game is basically different depending on which ranks appear in your thing. So here, as you can see, all of a sudden this is now fallen, even though it started off with easy mode. So it looks like hard mode is around 100. I don't actually know. Now, I actually don't know what these ranks are. As you saw, I was playing a fallen mode game, which means it was a high rank, even though I was only level 100 and the other guy was only level 66. So I don't know what constitutes mid, what constitutes low, which means that I don't know how to actually activate this. So we're going to assume if you're level 0, you can get low. But if you're mid, maybe level 50-ish, and then high is level 100 or above, or level 50 or above. I don't know. It just seems to be random. Well, not random, but we don't actually know what the physical ranks are or physical levels that you need to get for each game is. Furthermore, it's actually quite difficult if you're a high rank. In fact, it's impossible if you're a high rank to actually play a mid-game rank or mid-rank game. So actually, this enemy that I'm about to show is actually going to be one of the rarest enemies you see in the game, because for most people, they can't see it. It's impossible for them to see it because most of the time, you're playing high rank matches. I'm assuming that most people here are probably going to be above the level of 50, which appears to be the case that above level 50, you play high rank matches, but I can't confirm that. And it is only this mode for some reason which has a one PvP exclusive enemy. Other ranked matches don't. So low rank matches, they have normal, quick, speedy, slow, normal, hidden, all of these enemies basically from easy mode. Meanwhile, mid, that has normal, quick, speedy, slow, yes, and then elite, abnormal, armored, molten, reaver. So as you can see, it's like a blend of Molten mode, but also a blend of intermediate mode. Intermediate mode initially, and then some blending of Molten mode. Meanwhile, high rank, it's literally just entirely fallen mode, entirely. All of its enemies are basically from fallen mode, and they are basically fallen mode exclusives. For example, even the abnormal, that doesn't appear in intermediate mode, but it does appear in Molten mode. So again, initially, mid appears to start off with like intermediate mode leniencies, including like normal, quicks and stuff like that, but then it goes into elite abnormal, which is a Molten mode enemy. So it's just a weird mix. However, what is a weird mix is the Molten Hazmat. Yeah, here's something for you. The Molten Hazmat does not appear elsewhere. There is not a Molten Hazmat in Molten mode. The Molten Hazmat is the only enemy in PvP mode that can only be spawned in PvP mode. Now, there are enemies in each of the ranks, each of the ranked matches. And when I say ranked matches, I mean each of the either low, mid, or high rank matches, which, again, I don't know how it's determined. It's just there. But there are enemies within those ranked matches, each of the 3 categories, where enemies that don't appear in the game mode only appear in the ranked matches through sending. For example, the tank appears in low rank PvP matches because for some reason it's a send only enemy. Other enemies appear in low rank matches. They can be sent as well, but they are exclusive to easy mode as well, whereas the tank is not exclusive to easy mode. In fact, it doesn't appear in easy mode at all. I mean, yeah, the Gravedigger also appears, but that's because it was like a symptom of the fact that PvP testing was originally based on easy mode, and it's when it moved over to casual mode, they didn't update it. So it's not the brute that appears in low rank matches, it is the Gravedigger. But that's fine, I can accept that. Mid-rank, all of these enemies are, again, I mentioned before, a mix of Molten mode and intermediate mode. However, one of these enemies, being the Molten Hazmat, for some reason, the Molten Hazmat appears here. And if this looks familiar to you, it's because it is. It's already an enemy in the game. In Molten mode, the Molten Hazmat isn't called the Molten Hazmat. It's called the Elite Hazmat. This is what the Elite Hazmat looks like. This is what the Molten Hazmat looks like. It's the exact same model. Now, it's not like the Molten Hazmat is like exactly the same as the Elite Hazmat. For example, the Molten Hazmat has 400 health, whereas the Elite Hazmat has 300 health. Apparently, it has only default health, which is health that is used in case there is no health set for the game mode. However, its speed is actually the same as the Elite Hazmat, and so its defense, 60%. And the cash on death is also the same, 350 cash on death. Meanwhile, its attributes are also the same. Burn, stun, freeze. Meanwhile, here, it's burn, stun, freeze. So, the Molten Hazmat, apart from the default health, it looks exactly the same as the Elite Hazmat. However, they actually do have different icons. Apparently, according to Molten, this is the Molten Hazmat icon, and this is the Elite Hazmat icon. They are in different stages of running. Meanwhile, they have the same animation, I believe. This is the same animation used for both icons. It's just that they're different stages of running, which just goes to show that the developers have like made a new enemy. These are technically new enemies. This technically does mean that the Molten Hazmat has a logbook in the game. So in the index, if the Molten Hazmat appears and you can get its logbook, it appears separately to the Elite Hazmat in the index. So why don't we go get this logbook? Well, yes, a logbook does exist for the Molten Hazmat. However, one of the stipulations of logbooks is that they don't spawn in after an enemy is spawned in through means that aren't natural. Now, this does not include enemies that spawn in from other enemies. For example, the Molten Necromancer spawns in Molten Demons through its ability. However, that's still kind of natural. What I'm talking about is if a enemy is sent by a player, be it through admin commands or in this case PvP mode, that isn't counted as natural, and therefore a kill from that does not generate a logbook. The other instance is logbooks don't generate after kills in sandbox mode, but that doesn't apply here. It's the case that Molten Hazmat only appears in PvP mode, and because it's only a sent enemy, wave 15, you can start sending the Molten Hazmat. Because it doesn't appear naturally, it means you can't get any natural kills on it, therefore you can't get natural kills to contribute to the pity kill 60 or generate a random logbook basically. Therefore, this means that the Molten Hazmat is probably the only enemy in the game where a logbook does exist for it, or an index does exist for it. However, it is impossible to get its logbook because you cannot spawn this in naturally, or this doesn't spawn in naturally. You can't spawn things in naturally. That's why you cannot get this logbook. So even if you wanted to get into a mid-rank match, whatever, even if you got kills on the Molten Hazmat, they don't count as natural kills. Therefore, you cannot get its logbook. And even in this case, the Molten Hazmat is such a rare enemy anyway, because it can only be spawned in PvP testing and only in mid-rank matches. It's not like you can start up an ult and immediately get the Molten Hazmat anyways to appear, because it needs to be at least at, I think, about level 15 or level 25, I'm not entirely sure. But then after level 50, you're automatically placed into high-rank matches, therefore meaning that you cannot see the Molten Hazmat anyways. So even if the Molten Hazmat was a logbook, it would be one of the rarest logbooks that you can get, purely because most people who have progressed in the game cannot get it. It can only appear in mid-rank PvP matches, and most people are playing high-rank PvP matches. I don't think anyone who's playing mid-rank PvP matches is solely there for the express purpose of gathering logbooks. Furthermore, the Molten Hazmat, I don't want to say it's kind of a useless enemy, but it's kind of a useless enemy. Like, the only way, okay, let's hypothetically say that you can get the Molten Hazmat logbook by spawning it through PvP testing in mid-rank matches. It's going to be quite difficult unless you are purposely grinding out the Molten Hazmat logbook, because nobody's naturally spawning in, well, nobody's actually purposely sending the Molten Hazmat. By wave 15, it's 3 waves until you get the Reaver. Now, this is to say, from my experience in high-rank matches, most people don't even get up to wave 15 in high-rank matches. People only, if anything, people only get to like wave 11 before capitulating. Getting to wave 15 to grind out the Molten Hazmat is going to be impossible if you do it naturally and through matchmaking. You have to have it through the express purpose of getting Molten Hazmats, because after rank 15 it's only 3 more waves until you get the Reaver, and most people are probably going to send the Reaver. Now, if you're smart, you might get people sending in the Molten Hazmat for economy, because 20 economy bonus for 30 send cost actually is quite a good deal. And in fact, there are enemies where if you send it, you get negative economy bonus, which means that if you're not careful with your economy bonus, you might be accidentally sending yourself to the Shadow Realm, in terms of every 8 seconds you're losing money, which isn't obviously a good look. But in mid-rank matches, the Molten Hazmat is the strongest enemy technically for the send cost, that gives up the most economy bonus, that being 300 for 20. The Fallen in high rank matches fulfills the same purpose, but that starts spawning on wave 13, whereas the Molten Hazmat appears on wave 15. What I'm trying to say is that unless you are trying to build up your economy bonus, which by wave 15 you probably aren't, you're probably trying to kill the people or the other person, you're probably going to go for other high health enemies, such as, say, the Molten Golem, Molten Necromancer, or the Reaver. You aren't going to be spamming Molten Hazmats because they're quite easy to deal with, and something like the Molten, for example, that's like cheap to spam, I guess, and it appears earlier on. So by that stage, even by the Molten stage, I don't think people are going to be start spamming in enemies just to boost their economy bonus. I mean, I don't know, because I still do spam my enemies just for economy bonuses, but by this point, the other person would have capitulated by the amount of spam that you're doing to them. Again, these are factors where I don't think many people in mid-rank matches are spawning the Molten Hazmat, and even if you could get its logbook, which you cannot get its logbook, bearing in mind that, you aren't naturally getting the Molten Hazmat logbook anyway. Now, while I'll say this is the first enemy where it's impossible to get a theoretically possible logbook, it's not technically the first enemy that the people consider a different enemy to get no logbook status. I think there are two more prominent candidates for this, that being the Awakened Fallen King and the Corpse. Now, technically, the Awakened Fallen King is not its own enemy. It's technically a second phase of the Fallen King. Therefore, if you kill the Awakened Fallen King, it counts towards a Fallen King logbook kill, not a separate Awakened Fallen King logbook. Because the Awakened Fallen King is technically not its own enemy. As listed on the trivia for the Awakened Fallen King, the Awakened Fallen King is technically not a separate enemy, but instead the second and later third phase for the Fallen King, because it does have a rage mode, that being Complete Awakening. Next, the Corpse enemy is also technically not its own enemy. It just takes the form of the enemy that it just recently died from, when the enemy has the Corpse attribute. As the trivia states on the wiki, the Corpse is actually not its own enemy. It is actually just the enemy it spawned, which has been revived and its statistics altered. The Corpse, to show this, the Corpse actually keeps the statistics of the original enemy, and it keeps the abilities of the enemy. For example, the Corpse of the Templar, even though the Corpse itself is immobile, it can actually move after using its ability. Now, obviously, the Templar doesn't spawn in with Corpse naturally, but if you apply Corpse to Sandbox Mode Templar, this is how you get the Corpse attribute doing weird things to enemies. Another honorable mention is the Abomination, where after you kill it, it turns into the Reanimated, and technically this is it's an enemy separate in the similar vein to how the Corpse and the Awakened Fallen King are separate, but again, it doesn't have its own logbook. There is no reanimated logbook. It's just the Abomination logbook. Then there's the lower body enemy, which is not its own separate enemy again. It's based on the splitter enemy. Once the splitter enemy splits, it turns into the upper body, which ironically enough is its own enemy. You can get the upper torso whatever enemy. Actually, it's called the split, but actually internally it's called the upper body. Whereas the lower body is actually contained within the splitter enemy, so you cannot get the lower body logbook. It's just based on the splitter enemy, so a kill with the lower body counts towards the splitter logbook, not a lower body logbook, for example. Which does lead to the weird case where in sandbox mode, you can spawn in the entire body or just the top part of the split, but you can't spawn in just the lower body, which, I mean, kind of makes sense. You wouldn't want to be spawning in just legs. Although, actually, some people might want to be spawning in legs because of their, shall we say, desires. Now, I'm very sure that there's going to be some hackers in the game who try and attempt to get the Molten Hazmat logbook because they are completionists, or they're idiots, or they want to get banned by Tower Defense Simulator. Because do bear in mind that Tower Defense Simulator does go after those who use hacks. Although I didn't see a ban wave for this update, but I'd have to assume that they're coming. Now, a side effect of this is that I don't think you can spawn in the Molten Hazmat into sandbox mode. No, you can't spawn in the Molten Hazmat. Despite it being an enemy that does appear, not naturally, but appears in PvP mode, you can't spawn it in. But you can spawn in the Elite Hazmat. Now, I do have admin mode, so I should be able to spawn in the Molten Hazmat, because the Molten Hazmat is a modern enemy. The only problem is it's not whitelisted, so I can't spawn it in. But the Elite Hazmat is basically the Molten Hazmat, except for 100 less health. So really, I'm not really missing out on much, but this enemy is technically the Elite and the Molten Hazmat. Now, interestingly, it must be said that the inclusion of the Molten Hazmat is likely a glitch, because actually the Molten Hazmat has actually been in the game for quite a while. It's just that in Molten mode, they've used the Elite Hazmat and they've not used the Molten Hazmat. Now, the Molten Hazmat, again, like I said, is probably a mistake by the developers. They've accidentally just copied over the Elite Hazmat and given it Molten Hazmat mode. But interestingly, the Molten Hazmat has appeared, or has at least appeared in the game's code, since the Molten mode update, or the Molten mode rework. So technically it is an unused enemy, except now it's used, but I'm going to be 100% sure with you that 99.999% of you will never see the Molten Hazmat spawn in anyways, because firstly, you need to get into a mid-rank match. Secondly, the other opponent or yourself needs to get up to wave 15, so you don't need to absolutely go at each other. and then you need to spawn it in. I don't see it likely, most people not seeing it, basically. Now, it could have been like a leftover thing from when the developers were like renaming stuff in Molten mode. For example, the commander in the Molten mode rework calls the Elite Abnormal the Abnormal boss. So it could be the case where the Elite Hazmat was the renamed version of the Molten Hazmat, and the Molten Hazmat was meant to get scrapped or whatever, or just have a changed name, but for whatever reason it's kept around in the game's code. And I believe a tester has actually confirmed this. So when someone said that the commander's an idiot, he couldn't get his own dialogue correct, I believe this is a tester. That's because the enemy was formerly named the Abnormal boss, confirming that there was some renaming of enemies from testing to the final release, which seems to be the case here. The Elite Hazmat was a renamed version of the Molten Hazmat. Now, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because there's nothing really molten about the Elite Hazmat. There's no like burning stuff like the Elite Molten here. It's just, for some reason, it's a hazmat with green rips. So yeah, I can actually totally see why developers renamed it to the Elite Hazmat and not just the Fallen Hazmat. Oh, sorry, not the Fallen. You see, it's different. It looks like a Fallen Hazmat. It doesn't seem like a Molten Hazmat. And for whatever reason, in PvP mode, they accidentally used the Molten Hazmat instead of the Elite Hazmat. The developers have secretly leaked an unused enemy from the Molten mode rework. Yeah, it's funny, I guess, but I don't think the developers really care too much. After all, it's the same enemy with just 100 more health. And 100 more health because I don't think it even has like a set health anyways. Is it really its own different enemy? I mean, I'd consider it a different enemy. The wiki certainly does, but it's up to you to decide. But that does mean if you're a completionist in Tower Defense Simulator, you cannot get all the logbooks, because there's one logbook that, for an enemy that's in the game, you cannot get. And it's a theoretically possible logbook, but until the developers add the Molten Hazmat naturally spawning into Molten mode, which they're probably never going to do, you cannot get a logbook of an enemy that does appear in the game perfectly legitimately, not hacking like the Pleasonate enemies. You just can't get his logbook. And in fact, I just realized that you cannot get the Molten Hazmat logbook even if you do hack, because the enemy still needs to naturally spawn in. Now, I'm not going to go through how people have hacked logbooks. It is possible, but suffice to say that they are natural spawns. The hackers haven't like spawned them in because it'll count as their own spawn, and you can't get a logbook out of spawned enemies from yourself. That's including through, I've said this before, through admin commands or through PvP testing. You can't do that. And because the Molten Hazmat does not spawn in naturally through a wave structure and can only be spawned in by other persons, it means that even if you hack Tower Defense Simulator, you cannot get the Molten Hazmat logbook. Even though it does exist, you just can't get it. You may argue that there are thousands of other unused enemies in the game's code that you may not be able to get because they don't spawn in naturally. I'm not going to reveal which ones they are because I'm pretty sure Below Natural is sweating as I say that statement. But what sets apart the Molten Hazmat from all of those enemies is the fact that the Molten Hazmat does appear in Tower Defense Simulator. You can spawn it in through PvP mode, mid-rank matches, but you just cannot get its logbook because it doesn't spawn in naturally.